Okay. Um, yeah, good morning, guys. I just had a wonderful conversation with Dawood. Um, but anyways, what I'm thinking about the conversation that I just had with Dawood, and one of the things that came up was the kind of violence that is done in our everyday kind of life. And we kind of exchanged examples back and forth, but actually one example that I said was was a kind of violence was like, for example, I had a I'll use a personal example. My personal example that I used to show that there's a kind of quotidian violence was when I asked a girl for her number, right? And it's funny because most of us would be like, what do you like, there's no kind of violence in that, kind of action. But I want us to think about not violence from a kind of perspective of like, this person is like physically harming me or anything like that. Um, but basically, the kind of violence that I'm talking about is like the you inserting somebody into a kind of psychological tension. And by you putting somebody in a psychological tension, there's a kind of violence committed in that sense. Of course, this isn't like some type of moral violence or whatever. It can be, but what I'm trying to say is that it's a kind of violence. And what do I mean by that kind of violence? Well, um, in the example of like asking a girl for her number, um, there's a couple of things in our contemporary culture, the way we understand this interaction is made. Either for some people, it's a completely innocent engagement. But in my opinion, if they assume it's an innocent engagement, then they don't understand the possible violence in the question, right? Now, I would say the woman that is being asked, or the person that is being asked, um, if they know the risk, they all of a sudden understand that there's a violence being committed. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you are placing somebody in a position of trying to assess the intentions of the one asking for a number, right? So, for example, maybe a more paranoid person the thoughts may be something like this. It might be like, um, if I give them my number, will they just, assume that we're friends, or are they going to start assuming that I'm interested in them? Um, is you know is this just an innocent asking of a number, like they really just want to get to know me, or are they just trying to sleep with me, or what is it that they want from me in this case, right? What is it that this person specifically want, like what is the person's intentions um in asking and trying to get my number, something like that, right? So there's a kind of that's what I mean by like the kind of violence. The fact that you, by asking a question, you propel somebody into a series of these questions and doubts, and them trying to figure out like what is it that you possibly want. Now, um, so yeah, and this is what also kind of propelled me to ask, you know, is there really ever such thing? Is there such a thing as an innocent question? And immediately after my discussion with Dawood, I don't think there's actually such thing as an innocent question. I don't think, because we have this tendency to be like, oh, it's just a question, it's just an innocent question, like, blah blah blah. But I don't think, I mean, You know what's funny about the statement? Actually, no, let's use this as an example. The very fact that somebody says that by virtue of the fact that somebody has to preface the question by saying, hey, it's just an innocent question. Don't think anything more of it, or blah, blah, blah. You know why they're saying that? Because they understand the violence of that question. And by virtue of that violence, that question is not innocent. They're just trying to temper the violence of the question, but the question itself is not innocent, not in any way, because they have to temper the question by prefacing it and saying, "Oh, it's just an innocent question. Like I'm not trying to do anything more than what it seems." You see, they already understand the violence of it, but they are mistaken in still thinking that by them prefacing it, it doesn't still commit a kind of violence. Um, they're simply trying to temper it, but it doesn't actually take away the violence completely in any sense. You may help somebody see the violence of the question more apparently, but again, by you saying this is just an innocent question, don't think anything more of it, you are already displaying in a very ironic way the violence of the question. Like but just by fact that you have to say, look, it's innocent. Like trust me, it's innocent. It's innocent. Um, it's like similar to like a courtroom case where it's like, you have to prove the guy's innocence. But what's funny about trying to prove a person's innocence is that there's a violence being committed in that. Like the fact that we have to prove a guy's innocence, that is something violent. Like we don't already take it as true that he's innocent. So that means that there is already kind of violence taking place of the fact that you have to prove to this person that he's innocent. And by virtue of proving it, it's proving the concept of proving. What I'm trying to say is violent in itself. Proving something is a kind of violent act. Of course, again, because I can, sometimes like I can just like hear the people that randomly do watch my videos and the people that know me here, right? They they may get the impression about what I'm saying is not uh it, it, you know that this isn't true, you know. But proving it is a kind of violence in itself. It's not a moral violence, of course, but the concept of like trying to prove something to somebody is definitely a kind of violence because what you're doing is you're trying to take over the interpretation. You're literally trying to take over the interpretation, and by taking over the interpretation, you're trying to prove that there's a weaker interpretation. So in that sense, it is a kind of violence. Um, especially if we think about violence as as if we think about the logic of violence in the way that I'm understanding it, so you guys can understand it now. There may be like a whole philosophical type of, so maybe Foucault defines violence in a kind of way or whatever. I don't know those definitions. But if you say something to me and be like, well, Foucault actually identifies violence as this, then ironically, to my definition, you are committing a type of violence to me. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not adding a value judgment by saying like, oh, it's bad to do that. I am just saying that there's like there's just violence everywhere. Like it's we have to understand that what we do and what we say, there's always a kind of violence being done. And it's more about what I'm stressing is like if you don't have the awareness of that violence, then it's more dangerous for you to not know that there is a kind of violence being done. Because then what's going to happen is like, as a person, you just might not understand why people act the way that they're acting. Essentially, you may be confused about like why is it that this person is reacting in such a crazy way? Why are they upset? Why are my relationships diminishing? Um, so if we understand that actually there's a kind of violence being done just by virtue of a question mark. I think ask let's just take the most supposedly innocent question like, "How was your day?" How was your day is, believe it or not, is a kind of violence. Because and I'll just kind of share with you my phenomenological process of thinking about this when somebody says, "How was your day?" Now, again, I'm not saying, I want to preface this because I understand the violence of this. It doesn't make it any less violent. But what I'm just trying to say is that when I say this, I don't mean moral violence. I don't mean some type of ethical violence. I'm just saying there's a kind of excessive violence that cannot be categorized as moral or ethical, but there's a kind of just violence between subjects, just between subjects. And you can say maybe by virtue of just language, and maybe this is the part where it gets Lacanian in a sense. But um, what I mean to say is like when we ask somebody about their day, um, you provoke them to go into a self reflection. Like you almost force them to go into a self reflection of like, oh, yeah, how is my day? And then by putting them in this position, you may make them realize that they're having a bad day, right? Um, or you may force their hand to give a kind of diagnosis to their day, without them really knowing it. Like you're basically, you may even be forcing their hand to reduce their day to something. Like how was your day is like that. There is a kind of violence in that question. Just, I mean, again, I'm not saying like I'm exempt from this, and I'm not saying anybody's exempt from this. We have all asked, how are you doing? How is your day? What I'm trying to get at is I'm just trying to say, like, look, even these questions, they come with a kind of violence, because what ends up happening is that in a very bizarre way, you push the person to make an assessment and a reduction about their day at the same time, right? And that's the kind of violence that I'm talking about. Like just the fact like you have to reduce the day in order to answer the question about how was your day. Like you have to reduce it. Like you're forcing them and saying, look, pick something and tell me about your day. Like tell me what it is. Tell me what happened. And maybe it's possible that maybe the person wasn't even thinking about this, right? They were just sort of like, to me, this happens all the time. Like I'm just going about my day. Like I'm not assessing my day in terms of good or bad. I'm just kind of going through the motions. Like I'm just like, I think Ebert said something like, actually most of our actions are kind of like somewhat like unconscious. Like we're just sort of just going through the motions, right? But the violence that's committed is when somebody says, "Hey, how's your day?" And then that jolts you out of your unconscious automatic self, and you're like, "Yeah, how was my day?" It's the same kind of violence when adults go to kids and say, "Hey, what do you want to be when you grow up?" Right? Like that is such an existential question, and you're already kind of placing a value that they are unfamiliar with. But because you're asking that question, you are kind of like telling them like, yeah, you should value, like you should care like what you want to be. You should think about what you want to be, even though you're 5 years old. Like that's something violent. Like that something is that is the kind of violence. Um, and sometimes it's funny because in daily conversations, like someone might say something like, "Oh, tell me how your day really was. Like, don't just tell me like, oh, it was good, it was fine. Don't just tell me that. Like, tell me what actually happened. Like, I don't believe you." Um, so I want to challenge this interaction, and I'm always like challenging. I think what's difficult for me, like as as a thinker, is like I nobody to me nobody escapes. Nobody is scot free from any interaction. Like not a damn person is scot free. Like there's no superior ground that you can take and act like you didn't become implicated in the process. Like there is no way. Like if there's anything that's like my personal philosophy in a way is that any human interaction with any being is like you are implicated from the start. We all commit a kind of violence in a variety of ways. But as I've been repeatedly saying, this does not mean technically, it does not technically mean a moral violence, an ethical violence, or whatever. But I'm just saying it's a kind of violence because you are forcing something, you are forcing something into the subject. You're shoving something in the face of the subject of the person. Um, it's kind of like it's kind of like saying something like to somebody like at 30 years old, right? Maybe a woman, and being like, "Oh, you didn't. I see that you don't have kids. Like you didn't want kids, right?" Like saying something like that, and then the girl might be like, "Well, maybe the girl has been like struggling to have kids, and now she's 30, and she's still struggling, but now it's like less and less likely that she will." And so somebody might say like, "Oh, you never wanted to have kids," because they're assuming that actually you would have kids when you're not 30, like when you're younger. And it's almost like the same thing with like asking like, "Oh, she's pregnant," like saying like, "Oh, she's pregnant, look." Or like, "Are you pregnant?" Like, like stuff like that. Those seemingly innocent questions turn violent very quickly because you don't know the other. And so what I'm trying to say is because we don't know the other and we never will, not in a full picture sense, uh, that not knowing is the kind of like little frame where all the violence is done. Like, within that frame of like not knowing, that's where we commit the violence because we don't know. And the same thing is like we don't know how these questions are not innocent. They're not innocent at all. They commit a kind of violence. The thing that we don't know is what kind of violence is being committed when the person is asking the question, right? And we try to temper that with uh, prefacing, like I've been prefacing multiple times. In some sense, I'm even committing a violence to myself just by constantly repeating what I'm saying right now because I'm like paranoid about how people are going to perceive and read the message, and it's the fact that I can't control it because I don't know what they're thinking. But I'm trying to like temper it. But even my act of tempering the interpretation, I'm already committing a kind of violence, even against myself, because I'm assuming that I can temper it. I'm assuming that I can mediate in some ways the perception of what's being said, and everything, and that's the violence too, you know. And I know people might have resistance against this because they'll be like, well, um, I don't think that's violence. I think that's just ignorance. I think that's just they don't know. Um, but yeah, that's what I mean. Like, there's a way in which, and actually, Dawood said this. There's even something violent about the non-action, like not doing anything is sometimes violent too. Like you be surprised. Like a I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, this is a cultural thing, but like for example, if I don't call my mom in a while, I'll get a text message and she'll say something like, "Hey, hope you're doing good. Call me whenever, call me more." Right? She'll say something like that. The way she phrases it, it's kind of like it's not aggressive, it's like very intimate. It's very intimate and you know caring. Like she just kind of wishes that I'd call her more, right? But you see, even within her little wish for me to call her more, that violence that is committed is basically her saying like, you know, like she's trying to help me not forget about a value. Like, hey, I'm your mom. You should talk to me. You should reach out. You haven't been doing that. It's that, hey, hope you're doing good. Call me more when you can. Like that sentence, innocent in itself, but it's seemingly innocent, but not really. Meaning like basically what the opposite, you can read the sentence in the opposite form. You haven't really been calling me, and it's possible that you don't even know that I'm not doing well. Right. So and it's also kind of very it's also a very sly obligation. It's a very sly demand. But again, the reason why I'm bringing up quotidian violence, everyday violence, is that this violence is something that eludes categorical um, understanding. Like, it's not necessarily a violence that is moral or ethical in nature. It's just a kind of violence that's done beyond categories because what it is like, you would never think asking, how is your day, as a question of violence. You would never think that. But the reason why it is, as I've said before, is because what you're essentially asking the person to do is to reduce their day to a kind of signifying chain of like, this is what my day means, right? Like you're forcing them to say something like that. And if they never had any conception of what their day was, then perhaps that lack of conception was what was allowing them to kind of just go through the day without placing any value, and it's just another day. But the moment that someone says like, how was your day, they're saying yes. They're like, it's like a demand to value your day. What is it? What's happening? Like, and that is a kind of violence like that I've been trying to say. It's like when these questions, these seemingly innocent questions, are not innocent because they carry a kind of value demand, a kind of meaning demand, a kind of meaning making demand, um, a kind of reductionistic demand. And I'm going to say something really ironic here. Um, yeah, I'm I'm going to say yes. We have to do that violence to some degree. And like I said in the beginning of this video, I'm not saying that you should never ask these questions because they're committing a kind of violence. What I'm trying to say is that actually you should continue asking how was your day and all that stuff, but with the preface of knowing that there is a kind of violence being committed. And just by virtue of that kind of awareness, I think, you know, we can be more like worrisome about like what is actually being said in questions and so on, and really there's an argument that can be made that's like, just interpreting is violent, and translators are the first ones that know that violence. They know that violence, but for some reason we think as translators, and yes, I do believe we are translators because you have to translate your experience, your emotions. um, for somehow as translators of the everyday life, we think that there's nothing violent about what we're doing. um, and we think that when we're interacting with other people, there's nothing violent being done, but there is a violence, and it's being done every day. It's everywhere. To me, it's the most elusive violence because it's like it looks normal. It's normal. It's banal. I think Daniel will probably quote to me, the banality of evil from Aaron Rand, um, which I guess that would be pertinent in some ways. Um, but yeah, it's a kind of violence. Like I said, it eludes categorical boxing. It's not necessarily ethical, not necessarily moral. Of course, all those questions can be in some ways. Just depending like how you ask it, and what is your actions and maneuvers about when you're asking it. Um, you know, some of us might think like, what kind of maneuvers or actions would how is your day look violent? I mean, you can say how was your day sarcastically. That's a kind of that's a kind of violence too. You can say it, um, in all types of ways to make it even worse than what it is, and that can actually broach ethical and moral lines, possibly, right? Um, so yeah, but again, my main point is not to necessarily deter us from asking seemingly innocent questions like, "Hey, how was your day?" or, you know, "What's your favorite book?" Even asking like, "What's your favorite book?" is, like I said, it's a kind of violence because you're asking somebody to pick something. You're actually demanding them to pick something. You know, maybe they had no conception of a favorite book, and you're saying, "Hey, what's your favorite book?" And it's funny because we think, "Oh, I'm just trying to get to know them," but in some ways, these questions is is demanding. You're demanding them to give you a favorite book, and to show you just to show you how everyday conversation kind of works, and because I know I was in this and I did these questions too, is okay, if they don't have a favorite book, they may say, "Oh no, I don't read. I don't have a favorite book." Right? That was one example of violence because you're making them realize that they don't read books and they don't have a favorite book, right? But then here's the other violence, right? Someone might say, "Okay, fine. If you don't have a favorite book, what's like your favorite genre?" Right? Like, and there we go with another sequence of violence. You're forcing them to pick. You're forcing them to choose. Um, and to me, this actually happens the most with small talk. Small talk is interesting, and it's funny because I've always hated small talk because small talk is, for me, probably the most violent of conversations because you have to. I don't even know how to perceive it. Like, there's so many ways to perceive it, but typically the way I perceive it is like when you have to make small talk, get to know your classmates, for example, you have to like almost act interested. Oh yeah, what's your name? Oh yeah, what's your major? Oh yeah, yeah. What's your what do you do? Like, oh, that's what you do. Okay. Okay. And you like philosophy? Oh yeah, what's your favorite philosopher? Oh yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. And then it's like, what's your favorite food? And it's like, oh yeah. No, I don't like that. And then I like this. And of course, again, seemingly innocent conversation, but what is really being done in that, it's funny that small talk is supposed to be um, the way into getting to know a person, but small talk is also the quickest way to reduce a person, right? Because you end up leaving the conversation with a kind of reduction. Oh yeah, um, he's a religious studies major. He likes to read. He's you know kind of short, um, and he's single. Like, and that's it. Like you come out with a reduction. you know. But what I'm saying is like that reduction is what is violence. Like you come out with a very nice little stick figure understanding of the person. And it's interesting that we have to spend, even do more violence to each other to realize that they are not those things. Like they are not any of those things. Like none of those things capture the person, right? And this is where love, at least people that are, I won't say love, I'll just say this: people that are libidinally invested in another person, they slowly start to see that violence over time. Like, but what I'm trying to say is like the violence was there was from the beginning. The reductionistic, um, qualitative trait, identifying, seeking, making, whatever. You saying, "Oh, he's nice. Oh, he opens the door for me," and da 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 da. Like again, all violent statements because you're reducing. You're reducing, and of course, I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I'm just saying that you're gonna see how violent this turns, right? Because what ends up happening is you get to know the person over time, right? And we keep committing more and more and more violence because we keep thinking, oh, I'm just simply stacking neatly these qualities and traits of the person, and I now I'm starting to have an understanding of who they are, right? But then, but then the most violent thing happens is when they start to realize that everything that they previously knew about this person is not entirely true. Like there's something in excess of what was being said and what's been experienced. And typically this manifests as, oh, why are you acting like this? This isn't like you. I know you don't you typically do this. Like like that whole situation, that whole dynamic, all those propositions, all those statements, violent. Violent. And but that is when the person is actually realizing the violence. Unfortunately, it's not realizing in the sense of that they know the violence was committed from the beginning. The way they understand the violence is the transgressions of the other. But what I've been trying to say is that actually what is perceived as the transgressions of the other is also been the violence of your interpretation, the violence of your reduction, the violence of you assuming that you know who they are inside and out. And so, in that sense, even by you saying, why are you doing this? Like, I never thought you would do this. It's not like you. Like, that whole act is That's violence, you know? And what I'm trying to say is that they don't understand that even though for them it's a perception of transgression, that the person has transgressed against them, the whole meeting from the beginning, from two people meeting, was a violent interaction. Of course, it's not violent and physical in any kind of ways, but it's almost as if what I'm trying to get at here is that it's a necessary violence. Some of it, like having to get to know a person if you're interested in them, you have to do a kind of violence, unfortunately. Um, but what becomes what I call dangerously violent is when you think that you actually understand them, that you think that you're actually getting somewhere with grasping the whole person. And for me, that is the most dangerous. And so the reason why I'm saying all of this is to say that, and the reason why I'm saying that these things are violent is because if you don't understand that there is a violence being committed from the very beginning, then you wouldn't be able to understand when it gets dangerously violent. If you understand that, look, I have to make reductions, I have to make assumptions, I have to interpret, then you understand very well the violence of everyday life. But if you don't understand the violence of everyday life, then you're going to be perplexed and confused about why is it that certain people just have such a, either a visceral reaction against you, or you may actually have an opposite encounter. You may be start thinking like, why is it that people change on me? Why is it that people don't say who they really are? Why is it that people say things and it's not true? And and all this stuff, and it may come off as a kind of blame and victimization of themselves. But ultimately what I'm trying to say is that violence is done on both, between all of us, you know and even the victim does a kind of violence, um, especially if it's not like a really clear take. Like the victim has to interpret, and there's a way in which there's a twofold violence, meaning like the victim has to interpret the 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 circumstance, and by virtue of interpreting that circumstance, he commits that violence upon himself to interpret it, to digest what just happened. And then, of course, the violence of what cannot be said, right? That what cannot be captured. And so you could say, if I'm using like Alex Ebert's language, it's the violence between absence and excess. There's a twofold violence happening in almost every interaction, a twofold violence. And if we don't understand that twofold violence, then we're going to miss crucial human interactions where we can realize that what we've done with each other when we're talking to each other is that we've made reductions, we've categorized, we've labeled, we've utilized them, we've used them, you know um, and that's the violence. But I'm just trying to say, of course it's inescapable, you have to do these things. But again, what I've been trying to say is that it's more violent if you don't know that you're doing these things. And it's and the way I'm saying this is to kind of frame it in such a way that you understand that not only does it kind of commit a violence against the other, but it commits a kind of violence on yourself. Because you give it's basically like whipping a person and then whipping yourself. Like that's kind of what interpretation does in terms of like a violence. But what I'm trying to say is more harmful possibly is that typically the person that's doing the violence, they don't understand that they're also doing the violence to themselves, you know? So in some senses, like it's almost similar to, I think it's funny because a lot of kids critique their parents for this statement when parents say, "Oh, trust me," it like when they're about to like discipline their kid, "Oh, trust me, it hurts me more than it hurts you," you know? In this case, the parent knows the violence that's being done. Like he fully knows the violence being done, and yet they still have to do it, right? They still have to discipline the child. So it's like they know full well that the violence that is being done and committed not only on the child but on themselves. And it's that exact statement that I'm trying to bring into our everyday life of something like that. Like, you know, when I ask you a question like "How was your day?" It should be something. It should feel something similar to me saying to a child like, "Hey, look, I'm sorry, but this hurts me more than it hurts you." Like I have to ask about your day. You know, I have to um, attempt to get to know you, and in my attempt to get to know you, I have to make reductions. I have to stuff you in a box. And yet I know that you cannot fit those things. But by virtue, I have to, because how else can we engage? How else can we have a relationship? How else can we start a relation, a conversation, and so on? So you can see how this is, you know, all very violent and in a kind of I don't know, maybe remorseful. I don't know. I wouldn't know how to put it that way, but Um, yeah, I really I really like the phrase of the famous parent line of like, "Oh, trust me, it hurts me more than it hurts you," right? Because, you know, that is when you really understand the kind of violence of the what is happening, what is occurring between two human relationships, you know, even between an animal too, you know. Um, but yeah, these are just crucial reflections. But anyways, take care. All right, bye.